Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Leibniz on substance. More specifically, we're going to be looking at Leibniz's Discourse on Metaphysics. This is Leibniz's really first foray into writing like a big philosophical treatise. It occurs really early on in his career, and it contains many of the most important aspects of Leibniz's philosophy that he's going to bring with him into his philosophical maturity. So for this week, our first video is going to be on the Discourse on Metaphysics, specifically examining Leibniz's conception of substance. And then our next video for this week is going to focus instead on Leibniz's much later monadology. We're going to see that there's quite a lot of continuity between these two texts, and that Leibniz's position on substance is really novel and unique. So to get things started, the magic, as it were, right, of Leibniz's philosophy happens between sections 8 and 16 of the Discourse on Metaphysics, right? The whole text is good and important, and I mean impressive how short it is and all of that kind of stuff. But here, in these sections, is where Leibniz gets the vast majority of his account of the nature of substance, which we're going to see is importantly different than what we saw in Descartes and Spinoza. The most important thing to start things out is to remember that when we talked about the primary truths essay, we established that the way that Leibniz thinks about the nature of truth is through an idea of concept containment, right? So, in other words, we ought to be able, for any given subject, to be able to know from the nature of that subject all of its predicates, right? We should know, in other words, from the nature of substance, all of the modifications that that substance will undergo in time. Right? So that's the theory of truth that we're working with. And really, Leibniz's account of substance is really just an elaboration of that view. Because what does it mean for Leibniz to be a substance? We saw that in Descartes, what it took to be a substance was independence, right? God has an absolute kind of independence. Finite modes have a dependent kind of independence in the sense that they are dependent on God, but no other finite substance. And then we saw Spinoza revises this conception to understand substance as causa sui, the cause of itself. Leibniz's definition of substance takes on important aspects from both of these views, but importantly gives it a rather novel and unique interpretation. So if you were to ask the question, what does it mean to be a substance for Leibniz? It means that you can satisfy that theory of truth that we just said. In other words, you can have a complete concept of this substance. Importantly, Leibniz doesn't think that bodies, for example, qualify, that we can never have a complete concept of a body in the way that we can have a complete concept of a substance, which he conceives of as a mind, right? So for Leibniz, anything alive, anything with a point of view on the universe, that's a substance. And in fact, we can give those living things who have a point of view, we can satisfy that criteria or characteristic for having a complete concept. Whereas physical bodies and things like that, we can never have a complete concept of. Not even God can have a complete concept of, because they are vague notions, right? So let's examine this idea. Leibniz has this notion that substances are the most real or most true beings. They're then physical bodies, which are phenomena or appearances of that substance. They therefore depend on that substance. And then there's space and time, which are themselves merely abstractions of the relationship between bodies, right? So in other words, the real thing, what's most real about reality, what's most true, the truest sense of reality, are substances or points of view. The second most real thing are what those substances see or what appears between them. And then finally, space and time, for example, are just abstractions of the relationship between those appearances. So substances truly exist, bodies are imaginary phenomena, and space and time are orders of relation between those phenomena. Now, why does Leibniz think that bodies by necessity involve a vague notion? Why is it impossible to give a complete concept of a physical body, right? And Leibniz's answer to this question is going to come in from his, what scholars call his argument from composition. Right? So Leibniz thinks that you can divide a physical body infinitely, right? You can just keep going and keep going and keep going with no stop, right? And so, for example, we think that things are exactly 15 feet, but why do we think that? Well, because our powers of perception are limited, right? If we had, for example, God's idea, right, God's understanding of the length, then we would know the length exactly. It would be 15 feet and 0.0000006413500, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? What this means is that physical bodies that appear unchanging to me are actually undergoing microscopic changes all the time, right? And so one way that Leibniz makes this point about the nature of physical bodies is to say that bodies are aggregates, right? They're like flocks of sheep. In other words, what makes a physical body a body is a certain kind of relationship that obtains between the parts, right? But of course, this relationship is only as real as those parts are, and those parts are, in fact, constantly changing, right? So it's not a real unity, right? It's a relation that appears stable to us because of our relative incapacity to see things clearly and distinctly. To get a handle on this, think about an ancient Greek philosophical problem, namely the ship of Theseus. This problem asks, sets up a situation in which Theseus is leaving. He has his ship, which is a physical body. It's composed of various parts, planks, etc. Over the course of the journey, it's necessary to make various kinds of repairs to Theseus's ship, so he exchanges some parts for other parts. And eventually, he goes through this process of completely changing every part that was in the original ship. Now, the philosophical question is that Theseus's ship anymore? Right? And Leibniz's answer is no. Leibniz thinks that physical bodies are just relations between the parts. As soon as you change one part, that relation is subtly different than it would have been otherwise, right? And so bodies, physical bodies, don't have the necessary conditions for unity. You could never give a complete concept of them because their concept is by nature vague. By contrast, right, for a minded entity, for something that has a point of view on the world, you can totally explain the nature of that thing, you know, assuming that you had an intellect like God's, right? In other words, you can know everything about that individual thing, what makes it an individual, all of the changes that it undergoes one by one, right? And it maintains a sort of coherent picture or point of view, right? In other words, you can give a complete concept of a perspective, but you can't give a complete concept of a perspectiveless entity. Excuse me. So, in other words, for me to be a substance, I have to be this unified thing, and I undergo various modifications, right? I'm a subject, and I have various predicates, right? So one of my predicates is curly hair. One of my predicates is philosophy teacher. One of my predicates is daughter. One of my predicates is sister. One of my predicates is wife, right? And these predicates, there's a huge amount of them, and they undergo changes all the time, right? But Leibniz's idea is that if you had the complete concept of penny, then you would know each of these predicates, and you would understand exactly why, for my point of view on the universe, each of these predicates was absolutely necessary from the essence of penny, as it were, right? So while bodies don't admit of a complete concept, right, perspectives or points of view do. That's what makes us substances on Leibniz's account. So we have to know all of my predicates, right, for me to be a subject, right, for me to be a genuine substance. But here's where things get rather interesting, right? Namely, that if you think about it, all of my predicates can only be those predicates because they exist in a causal nexus, right? In other words, they exist in the world with all of that other stuff, right? So, for example, I couldn't be a philosophy teacher if there weren't philosophy students. I couldn't be a wife, right, without my own spouse. And so, for all of my predicates, I express, in a way, the whole world in which I am a part, right? If for example, I have a certain temperature at every moment, right? If you wanted to give an account of that temperature, you would have to appeal to causal features in the world, right? And so in a way, the whole world is virtually contained within my substance. And it just so happens that Leibniz's picture is that every substance, every point of view in the world all express that same world. So you and I, for example, on Leibniz's account, don't ever have any causal interaction with each other, right? Say that that's the case. Nevertheless, God, who understands all essences perfectly, could look at my essence and simply know from my essence that you also belong to that same world that I occupy. We express the same world. And so all of us are, in a way, indecipherable texts to ourselves, right? I can't go through this process and simply know from my own essence every fact that there is in the world, right? There are all sorts of limitations on my perspective, my point of view, that doesn't allow me to do that. But if I had a perfect knowledge of that essence, then I could derive everything about the nature of the world. To end, this is what makes substances individuals, right? And one really, really unique aspect of Leibniz's philosophy is that he believes that individuals are more real than abstractions, right? So what makes my substance an individual is that it differs from all other possible substances, right? So we can think, for example, about different things counterfactually that I could have done with my life, right? I could have tried to be on reality TV. I could have studied Zen Buddhism instead of early modern philosophy, right? And for each of these alternative pennies, we can isolate a whole bunch of predicates that are different between them, right? That makes it so that you know that Zen penny isn't in this world, and reality TV show penny is also not in this world, and that instead we have early modern penny. So for Leibniz, the most fundamental stuff of the whole universe is not like physical bodies and their interactions, and that eventually gives way to life, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as I would say the standard view would have it. Instead, most fundamentally, what the universe is, it's just all the points of view that we can have on it. And if you want to know God's perspective, God's point of view, it's not that God has a mystical or a supernatural kind of knowledge, right? That is like forever beyond my reach. All that God has is a perfect knowledge of the harmonies that I have an imperfect knowledge of. In other words, Leibniz's God, his knowledge is just like mine, just with a higher degree of power. Leibniz's philosophy is about us all endeavoring to raise our own capacity for thought so that we can express not only the world, right, but in our judgment that the world is good, Leibniz thinks, we enter into what he calls the city of God, right? We enter as rational agents alongside God as the supremely rational agent, and we're able to rationally evaluate his works and deem them, as on Leibniz's obviously Christian point of view, to be good. What do you think about this idea? Leibniz thinks that the primary stuff of the universe are little crystallizations of the entire universe. Do you think that that is compelling? Do you think it's really weird, right? Does that make you attracted or disgusted by this kind of view? Please let me know what you think, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.